Hello, church family, and welcome to our video presentation for Saturday, September the 26th, which is actually being produced on Monday, September the 28th. And I apologize for my tardiness, but we should be back on schedule at the correct time this coming Sabbath. The theme of our last three Sabbath messages has had to do with the Samaritans, who they were, why animosity existed between them and the Jews, and Jesus' unique interactions with the Samaritans during his earthly ministry, and the lessons he taught then and now through those interactions. This week, let's hit our Bible's rewind button, so to speak, and go way back into the Old Testament, to the 27th book of the Old Testament as we have them categorized in today's Protestant Bible, to the book of Daniel. Daniel is the last book in our Bible before what used to be called the Book of the 12, referring to the writings of whom we call the 12 minor prophets. In today's Bible, they're separated as 12 distinct books. Why Daniel? Well, it kind of stems from our interesting and sometimes confounding examination of Revelation on our Wednesday night Zoom meetings, because there have been several times when we were going back and forth between Daniel and Revelation, comparing the two books as they relate to our exploration of end-time prophecy, or as the theologians call it, eschatology. Today, however, and next Sabbath, we're not looking into eschatology, but rather we're going to take a look into the first 6 chapters of Daniel, which are more historical and autobiographical in nature. Daniel telling his story leading up to his prophetic dreams concerning the end times. Today we'll look at the first 3 chapters of Daniel, and next week we'll take chapters 4 through 6. If you turn over to Daniel in your Bible and read through the introduction, you'll find out a few things, a couple of things. One, the book of Daniel was written by the prophet Daniel. It clearly states throughout the book that Daniel is the one doing the speaking. Well, you know what I mean. It is Yahweh who is always doing the speaking to us through the Bible. But Daniel was the writer, doing the speaking in behalf of Yahweh. If you can't take my word for it, take the word of Jesus, who quoted directly from Daniel's prophecy in Matthew 24, verse 15, and himself attributed the writings to Daniel. Secondly, Daniel probably completed this writing of the book around in the area of 530 before Christ, about a decade after Cyrus, leader of the Medes and the Persians, had captured Babylon in 539. In my Bible's introduction to Daniel, it outlines the book into 3 divisions. First is its prologue, which is contained in chapter 1, in which Daniel establishes the setting being that Daniel was among the many Israelites who had been carried away into captivity by the Babylonians, which had invaded and conquered Israel, both the northern kingdom and Judah in the south. The second division in my Bible's outline for Daniel is entitled The Destinies of the Nations of the World, which is comprised in chapters 2 through 7, written almost entirely in Aramaic. And the third division of Daniel, chapters 8 through 12, again written in Hebrew, is labeled in my Bible's outline as The Destiny of the Nation of Israel. Why did Daniel switch the languages up in these 3 divisions, you may wonder, as I did? Well, you'll notice from very early on in the book, beginning in chapter 1 and the start of chapter 2, there is mention of magicians and enchanters and astrologers. These were the supposed people who could, see outside the box, outside the normal range of experience, what we would call the paranormal. That's how they were viewed by the people, and that's how they presented themselves, and even by powerful people like the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar. But as we read, we see that this can be a risky business. The commentators of my NIV translation, New International Version translation, conjecture that since these smart guys, these astrologers and so forth, were from various places and racial backgrounds, they communicated in Aramaic, which was the common language that most everyone understood, as opposed to the languages, where they came from. Makes sense. So from verse 4 of chapter 2 in our Bible until the end of chapter 7, the Old Testament book of Daniel was written in this language, Aramaic, which we know that Jesus spoke to. The last 5 chapters, 8 through 12, revert back to Hebrew, probably because they deal in large part with the future of the Hebrew people, or Israel. This morning we're going to be generally focusing on the information found in chapters 1 through 3, basically the first half of the book, which is written from a third-person perspective, where Daniel, when writing about himself, uses the pronoun he instead of I. If you read on through the complete book, you'll notice that in the second half, beginning with chapter 7, Daniel gradually shifts into a first-person narrative, using the pronoun I more and more frequently. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Daniel writes to begin the book, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians, or Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. In the ancient Near East, it was common practice for invaders to displace the upper social levels of a conquered people, carting them off to their own country into servitude, just as was explained in Daniel there. That made good sense, so as to remove a likely source of continued resistance or insurrection if they were left at home there. Then the invaders would resettle the conquered territory with other conquered people from other places, which created the strong potential for a gradual mixing of cultural practices over time, which we made mention of in our previous discussion about the Samaritans. It turns out that Daniel was one of the Israelites who had been deported in the way just described, taken from the tribe of Judah to Babylon. Babylon, located in what is modern-day Iraq, was at that time one of the great cities of the world, but it would someday come to ruin, according to Jeremiah's prophecy. Babylon will be a heap of ruins, Jeremiah wrote, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives. Jeremiah 51:37. And so it is today. But in the 530s BC, the Babylonians were large and in charge, and the Israelites were at their mercy. As we already mentioned, Daniel and others like him were to be trained in the language and culture of the Babylonians, and they were to be housed and fed for that purpose, to enter the king's service. Among these, Daniel writes, speaking of the captives, were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Each of these new names reflected something pertaining to some foreign god that the Babylonians were familiar with. Marduk, Aku, or Nabu. And the food was also different. It was food that was considered unclean to the Israelites, either because it was unclean in and of itself, or because the first portion of it had been offered to idols. So in verse 8 of chapter 1 we're advised, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. That was a brave step, wasn't it? It goes on, now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. The chief official wasn't speaking lightly. He was reticent. He knew the price that might be paid for displeasing the king. But Daniel asked him, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. And treat your servants in accordance with what you see. Notice a theme mentioned here in chapter 1 of Daniel that we'll see again and again as we go forward. Not just here in Daniel, but throughout the Old Testament in particular, and the New Testament as well. Yahweh is sovereign. Yahweh is in control. It is Yahweh who caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. It was Yahweh who gave the Israelites into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 10 days, Daniel tells us, he and his companions, quote, looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Daniel continues, to these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So God is in control. God is blessing these men with special abilities. Who was in control? That's right, Yahweh. Who is in control? Right again. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. And why is that? What landmark event would come to pass in the future there and be marked by the first year of King Cyrus? The answer is found in the first chapter of Ezra, as well as the 36th chapter of 2 Chronicles. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any one of his people among you may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And the people of any place where survivors may now be living are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with free will offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. Ezra writes, the whole company that was brought back to their homeland numbered 42,360, besides their 7,337 menservants and maidservants. Presumably, Daniel and his companions were somewhere among those 42,360 Israelites who returned to Jerusalem. Why? Because the Lord, all capitals, as in Yahweh, moved the heart of the Persian king Cyrus, who was one of the successor rulers after the Babylonians. But back to Daniel's story. In Daniel chapter 2 is the account of how Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar began to have dreams that deeply troubled him, and he couldn't sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, he must have been in a special mood that day, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers asked the king in Aramaic a logical question. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. But here's the kicker. The king replied to the astrologers, this is what I have decided. I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. Can you imagine being one of the astrologers and hearing that you're going to be cut to pieces if you can't figure out what the king had dreamed? Tough odds, right? But if you tell me the dream and explain it, the king said, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. I'm sure that was of little consolation to the astrologers. It wouldn't have been to me. Once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it. Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me wicked and misleading things. Maybe he's thinking about the past, past experience, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. The astrologers answered the king, there is not a man on earth who can do what the king asked. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asked is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. This made the king so angry and furious, Daniel writes, that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. After Daniel was approached by the commander of the king's guard, Daniel asked the king for more time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Back with his friends, he urged them, we've got to pray, to pray with me to Yahweh. Why? Because Daniel knew that Yahweh was their only chance. Friends, that's our second point this morning. Second, even when things seem bad, always know that Yahweh is in control. Second, that was the first point. Second, when things seem to be stacked against you, always know that Yahweh is our only real chance. Yahweh can do for us what we know is impossible for us to do. During the night, we are told, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised God, the God of heaven, and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are His. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with Him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." Now you know the rest of the account. Indeed, Daniel was able not only to tell the Babylonian king what he had dreamed, but to interpret it as well. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler of the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. But just like a lot of people, maybe even us sometimes, not too long after being flat on our face, we're back to our old selves again. And that was the case for Nebuchadnezzar. We see in Daniel chapter 3 that before long, Nebuchadnezzar, quote, made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. My NIV commentators conjecture that this image probably represented the god Nabu, whose name formed the first two syllables of Nebuchadnezzar's name when spoken in Akkadian. The whole of Nebuchadnezzar's name meant Nabu, protect my son, or possibly Nabu, protect my boundaries. Nebuchadnezzar summoned all the officials from throughout the land to come to the dedication of this huge image that he had set up out there on the plain. And at this dedication, he proclaimed loudly, quote, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kind of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." At this time, Daniel relates, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews, being Daniel and his friends, right? They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever." That's how they always started out, smart. "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king," they told him, but there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Politics at work in the 5th century before Jesus. That was a fine thank you, wasn't it, to Daniel for having saved their skins earlier. You know what they say, no good deed shall go unpunished. Needless to say, being ignored by these young men from Judah didn't sit too well with Nebuchadnezzar, the head, ruthless head, of the preeminent empire of the world at that time. Furious with rage, Daniel writes, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is this true? I'll tell you what, I'll give you a second chance. And he finishes with another question. What God will be able to rescue you from my hand? How soon we forget. Well, the response of these 3 amazing men from Judah truly was amazing to those of us who haven't faced anything remotely like that in our lives. They said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Again, you know the rest of the story. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He ordered that the furnace be stoked hotter and hotter, so dangerously hot that his own men perished as they approached the mouth of the furnace. And as those men fell away, Daniel reports, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fully clothed and bound together, literally fell into the flames. But Nebuchadnezzar, who no doubt was expecting to hear screams and smell the flesh of these 3 men of Judah being consumed by the fire, saw something else, heard something else instead. Look, he jumped to his feet. I see 4 men walking around in the fire, 4, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. A son of the gods. Amazing. Daniel goes on to report that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerged from that fiery furnace that Nebuchadnezzar had threatened them with, everyone saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Impossible. Friends, I can tell you because of my own bad judgment what it's like to have your hair and eyebrows singed, and I can tell you that my clothes smell like smoke whenever I've burned leaves, and I can tell you that when fire burns you, you can certainly see the results and definitely feel the results, and sometimes, yes, smell the results, as awful as that can be. But on that day, back there in 530 before Jesus, there was none of that. Why? Because of that 4th person in the furnace. That one who looked like, as Nebuchadnezzar said, a son of the gods. Well, he was looking after his people. That son of the gods was looking after his people. There's a refrain we've seen, the chorus of one of our church hymns that goes, there is a God, he is alive, in him we live and we survive. From dust our God created man, he is our God, the great I am. Well, we know that Nebuchadnezzar had another change of heart, so to speak. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he exclaimed, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. But then he added, therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Still ruthless. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. As was the trend, Nebuchadnezzar's change of heart wasn't really a change of heart, because a true change of heart, we know, tends to last. Next week we're going to look at Daniel chapters 4 through 6 and see what God had planned for Nebuchadnezzar and for his successors as well, and for Daniel. But before we go, what are some things that we can take away from today's examination of chapters 1 through 3? Well, first and foremost, we can take away the assurance that God rewards faithful obedience, dedication to the way of righteousness that he has set before us. There is only one God, he tells us, and I am. The New Testament writer of Hebrews reinforces this view. Without faith, he writes, it is impossible to please God. And anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. When we do that, Yahweh is there for us, always. Secondly, humans, we're weak vessels, too often full of pride, too often caught up in the events and circumstances of our living reality, what we see and experience around us. Like Nebuchadnezzar, even when we see God working his wonders in our life and in the world around us, and acknowledge them, and even praise God for them, we easily forget the things he's done, and our thoughts turn inward again. And thirdly, lastly, we can be reminded once again that it is Yahweh, it is our God, who controls the events of the world. It was Yahweh who gave the Israelites into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, and it would be Yahweh who ended that kingdom. And it is Yahweh who will remain sovereign ruler of his universe when time itself has no more meaning. Church family, I think the most important encouragement we can take with us this Sabbath, or this Monday actually, is the assurance that God rewards those who earnestly seek him. Let's continue earnestly seeking him every morning when we get up out of bed and throughout every day. And pray that he'll give us the strength that he alone can give, strength that we don't have in and of ourselves, the strength to abide in him no matter what crisis we may face. God is able. He'll do it. I love you, and I hope to see you again next week in a timely fashion. Have a good week.